Now that we've made these color edits on Photoshop and Lightroom using Adobe Camera Raw, we're going to duplicate the same thing using cell phone applications. So we're going to use Snapseed and Photoshop Express. These are both free applications that are available on your cell phone where you can edit the photos and largely do what we've already done on the desktop. So let's take a look and see how close we can get to what we've done before. So here we've got the same photo that we worked on before on the desktop. We're working on it in Snapseed on the cell phone. And you can see I have the picture open, and on the right-hand side there are three icons, the middle one being a pen, which is the icon for the tools to manually make adjustments, which is what we're going to do. So if you press on that, it brings up a bunch of other tools. And you can see the first on the upper left is Tune Image. And that's where we're going to start. So you press on that, and you can see there's an icon for sliders at the bottom, which brings up a bunch of other tools. So if we press on that, we can bring it up, and we have brightness, contrast, saturation, ambience, highlights, shadows, warmth. So let's start with shadows. We want to probably deepen them, and so by sliding to the left you can deepen the shadows, and sliding your finger to the right you can see it lightens them. So let's slide to the left and deepen them a little bit. We don't want to get them blocked up, and then we'll hit the slider icon again and go for the highlights. And the highlights, the same thing. If I slide to the right, it gets very light, we lose a lot of detail. If I slide to the left, you can see it actually brings back a lot of detail on the clouds, and we get a lot more drama going on. So in this case, let's lower the highlights. And if I press the slider icon again, we can go to Ambience, which is a peculiar adjustment that's only in Snapseed. We don't see this in other programs, but it seems to have the ability to add contrast without affecting the deep darks or lightest lights. So if we increase the ambience, you see we get a lot of contrast and a lot of drama, but we're really not losing detail in the deep darks. So this is sort of a magical filter, which seems to be good to use. So I'm going to increase that. Let's hit the slider icon again, and let's go to contrast. And if we increase contrast, you see we can get a little too much, but if you bring it down by sliding to the right and to the left, you can make an adjustment that seems to help the image. And then let's go to brightness just to open up the image a little bit to make sure we don't have a lot of deep tones in there. So that's what we've got. So let's hit the check mark to accept all these adjustments. And then we'll hit the tool icon again in the middle on the right-hand side, and let's bring up details. And details, if you press the slider icon in the middle at the bottom, we can have structure or sharpening. And the structure is pretty much the same as the texture adjustment we saw in Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. So if I slide it to the right, you can see the water ripples get much more pronounced, and the clouds get a lot more pronounced as well. We're building up a lot of contrast where there's a transition from light to dark. So if we slide to the left, you see it just gets very soft and we lose all detail. So sliding to the right quite a bit seems to really help the image a bit, and brings up a lot more drama and a lot more interest in the clouds and the water. So here we have a plus 56, so we'll accept that. And then finally we can go to white balance, where again pressing the slider icon at the bottom brings up temperature and tint, just like we had before. So the temperature affects the blue and orange spectrum. So if we slide to the left, the image gets cooler and blue, or we slide to the right, it gets more orangey or yellow. So we just want maybe a little bit of that, of the orange, just to capture more of the orange color in the clouds as contrast against all the blue haze. We could go to the tint, and you can see it's going to have the same red and green variant. So if you slide to the right, we get a magenta or reddish color. Slide to the left, we get green. We don't really want any of that. We could go to the right a little bit, very little. I don't want to go too far. And so you can see we've added quite a bit. So I can hit the check mark on that, accept it, and if I want to do further refinements, I can go back and just make more adjustments. I can go back to Tune Image, hit the center, and maybe go to, let's say, Shadows, if we want to bring it down just to try to get a little more contrast going. And it seems to be a pretty dramatic shot at this point. You can really keep on trying to find more things to do. I can go back to Ambience, bring that up, and really seems to make a difference. And so you can see there's quite a bit that can be done with this application. So again, we're working with the same image that we did in the other applications, the same we did on the computer with Lightroom and Photoshop, and what we did in Snapseed on the cell phone. So here it's Photoshop Express, and it's fairly similar to what we've done in the other programs. You can see at the bottom there's some recipe adjustments that you can do automatically. So you see Vibrance, Spring, etc. We're not going to do that. We're going to go the manual route. So if we go over to the slider icon at the bottom, right there, you can see it brings up a bunch of adjustment sliders that we can do that are fairly similar to what we've seen before. So just starting from the left, we'll start with clarity and hit on that, and you can see if we slide it to the right, we get some contrast in the sky. If we slide it to the left, we get very soft and painterly, just like we saw before on the computer. So I'm going to bring it to the right and bring up some contrast, and it doesn't have a huge effect, but it's certainly helpful. Then we're going to work on over to the right and go to our dehaze filter, just like we did before on the computer. In this one, you can see if I bring it to the right, it's a pretty dramatic difference in the image. Bringing it to the left, again, it gets lighter and very soft. So we're going to slide it to the right, and we don't want to overdo it because we're not looking for an artificial look to this, but you can see bringing it up substantially to about a value of 50 or so brings a lot of contrast and definition into the clouds and the water, and we're getting a little bit of color back also. So it works pretty nicely. We can go to exposure then, because we don't want to get it overly deep and dark. So just increase exposure a little bit. That's going to be more of our midtone values. And then we can go on to contrast if we want to bring that up just a little bit. And then go to our highlights. We can bring it up a little bit because, again, we want to maintain some contrast. The shadows, we can open them up a little bit to get some detail into the mountains. And then if we go to whites, this is just like we saw on the computer, where the whites and blacks are the extreme ends of the spectrum. So if I bring up the whites, you can see it's getting much, much brighter, but I don't want to blow out detail. And the same with the blacks. I can bring that down to get some more contrast, but again, I don't want to block up the values. So we'll bring it down a little bit. And then we've got temperature. This is our color temperature, just like we saw before on the computer. So if I slide it to the right, it gets very warm and orangey or yellow. If I slide it to the left, it gets very blue. So we want to be a little more careful with this. I don't want to go too much. So if we slide it to the right a little bit, we're picking up some of the orange and warmer colors in the clouds and the water, and it really seems to help. And then we can go to our vibrance and saturation sliders, which affect the color intensity, again, just like we saw online on the computer. And if I bring up the vibrance, you can see we're getting some real color back in the clouds, and the blue or the bluish green, it's getting a little more intense in the mountains too. So we don't want to overdo it. Let's go to a value of about 13. And if I go saturation, same thing. If I go all the way to the right, it gets a little artificial looking. If I go all the way to the left, we get a black and white image. So we can bring it up a little bit. I'm just going to go with like a 3 or a 5 here. And so you can see just by using these simple tools, and within a couple of minutes, we've dramatically improved the image. And you can see there's a lot of potential in using the cell phone apps if you don't have a computer and something like Photoshop or Lightroom available to you. So you see how we were able to get pretty close to the same thing that we did with the computer with the cell phone applications. Again, we're not getting the same level of nuance and detail that we could get on the computer, but we can get pretty close, and it's kind of nice to see with a simple app in a couple of minutes of time, we can get at least a much better photo than what we began with. So, try them out, experiment, and see what you can come up with.